Let's not forget that these are extremely difficult operations. This is 100 miles of pretty rough sea against a well-defended island. You've only got about 13 beaches where you could land on. The economy is likely to collapse, but people will be pretty angry by losing their only children. And, his reputation for clear guidance, good governance would be in tatters.
So I just wanted to get your take on some of the big issues facing China at the moment. So to start with, what do we know about Xi Jinping's psychology? Does his worldview lean toward extreme caution until conditions are more absolute? Or does his fear of showing weakness make him willing to take an existential gamble with a possible invasion of Taiwan?
Domestically, one could say that he is a risk taker in the way that he's dealt with politics inside the Chinese Communist Party, but that externally he's shown a lot more caution. And I think you're right to say that it would be an existential gamble on Taiwan. I mean, if he failed, then I think he risks personally, but also possibly the Communist Party, risks being swept away in the reaction from in the mainland, not just because the economy is likely to collapse, but people will be pretty angry by losing their only children. They only have one child. After the one-child policy in Taiwan, it would bring there would be great economic dislocation, which would lead to unemployment, etc. And his reputation for clear guidance, good governance would be in tatters. So that would be at one enormous risk, and I would be very surprised if he were to take it without being as close to 100% sure that he would win in Taiwan. There's been a massive program on over the last year or two of sweeping away generals, either because they're corrupt or maybe because they're not actually carrying out his orders and getting ready for Taiwan, getting the People's Liberation Army in a fit state so that it could invade Taiwan by 2027, which is the sort of target for being ready, not for invading, but for being ready. I think that of course corruption has been a major driver in getting rid of those generals. Xi Jinping's been very clear that he's going to start, or that he will hold top leaders responsible for setting a good example, and if they don't, he gets rid of them. But I think there's also quite a certain amount of chatter which suggests that he's not pleased with the actual performance of some of these generals, and that in a way suggests that if he's learning that their performance isn't good, that he's actually getting decent information in order to be able to reach the conclusion that it hasn't been good, and so he's getting rid of them. So I suspect he has a pretty good idea of the situation in Taiwan, both militarily and in terms of the civilian population or the government, things that he needs to know before he makes a decision as to whether to invade or to seek other means to bring Taiwan to reunification, as they say. Others of us would say unification, because Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China.
If Beijing decides to act, what would an operational campaign realistically look like?
Let's start with a high-risk amphibious assault. Let's not forget that these are extremely difficult operations. I mean, D-Day very nearly didn't succeed, and that was massive preparation for it. This is 100 miles of pretty rough sea, far longer than D-Day, against a well-defended island. You've only got about 13 beaches where you could land on. Of course, you'd send in airborne troops, but they're at great risk of being shot out of the sky, particularly as drone technology increases. So if the Taiwanese have prepared properly, it would be extremely difficult to invade, and the chances are that you wouldn't succeed. And you've only got certain windows anyway, weather-wise, because it's a pretty rough sea there. So there would be, I think, a pretty clear warning of what was going to happen. You have to, for an assault like that, muster vast numbers of troops and materiel and air support, etc., etc. And so there would be time, I think, in that sort of circumstance, for the Americans and others to reinforce and make it even more difficult. So I'm very doubtful that there would actually be an invasion. And then, well, you talk about a sort of grey zone blockade, but again, that's quite risky. Will the Americans run the blockade? But more to the point, I think, if you blockade, well, this is a very busy strait, the Taiwan Straits. This around that area, I can never remember the figure, but let's say something like half. 30% of global shipping passes through that strait, linking the Far East to markets in Africa and Europe, etc., the Middle East, etc. I mean, this would shipping rates would go through the sky. Insurance would go through the sky if ships were willing to run that blockade or go into that area. There's going to be an economic meltdown globally in Taiwan. And of course, the mainland is well connected to China. Mainland China is well connected to the global markets, so there will be a massive downturn there as well. And then you get into a scenario of mass unemployment in China, and there's already very high unemployment in China. And what are the boys and girls going to do in China if you've got no job, nothing to eat, no money? Then I think you're going to turn on someone, and all good things come from the party, but all bad things, the flip side of that coin is that all bad things are blamed on the party. And I think that too would end up the likelihood of an existential threat to the party, massive unemployment, massive instability aimed at the party. And if I can work that calculus, I think Xi Jinping can too. And the one thing that he's not going to take a risk is falling from power, because that's really dangerous. It's not like a Westminster election. You might get back again in 5 years. This is the system being swept away, and with it, the individuals, possibly even losing their lives. So I think it's much more likely that they will continue to put other forms of pressure on Taiwan and its people to convince them that unification is irresistible and inevitable, short of the sorts of measures that you've talked about, blockade or invasion. I mean, that said, I don't entirely rule out some minor military activity. So there are sets of islands in the South China Sea. There's one lot called the Pratas Islands, the Dongsha, and the Taiping Islands, which currently are occupied by very small Taiwanese forces. It wouldn't take much in what looks like a military exercise to dislodge those and take those, and that would give Xi Jinping some kudos with his people that he was moving forward with the agenda of recovering these, what they like to think of as lost territories, without provoking the Americans and others into a really hostile stance.
Does Xi Jinping view time as being on Beijing's side, or does he believe China's strategic window of opportunity is quietly closing, forcing a faster timeline of events?
Taiwanese people do not want to be unified with Beijing. And if you look at polls which are carried out in Taiwan, I can't remember the exact figure on the most recent one, but it's about 6% of people would support unification with Taiwan. Most people, given the threats, would like life to continue roughly as it is. A small number would advocate independence, but that would be, I think, a very foolish thing to do, because then we would see. I think Xi Jinping probably would take up armed choices. So, yes, China is hitting some pretty severe problems. I mean, you mentioned the demographics. The economy is decaying. It's despite all the propaganda, I think in real problems. But I think Xi Jinping has probably no other choice other than to wait and continue to put pressure on the Taiwanese to, as I said, to convince them that this is irresistible and irreversible, and then work towards the sorts of conditions which might allow him to take a more forceful line. And I don't entirely rule out invasion or military means in the very longer term, but I do always suggest that there might be 6 conditions for that, and until the Chinese have met those conditions, I think they're onto a loser if they do invade. Now, what would those 6 conditions be? Well, first of all, it would be that Xi Jinping believes that the People's Liberation Army has overwhelming military power and effectiveness, so it can win in a very short time and not get bogged down in a war, which would be, against fellow Chinese as far as they're concerned. And will have seen what happened in Ukraine, where Putin was confident that the war would be over by Christmas, so to speak, and here we are. 4 years on, it's dragging on. So that's the first condition. I think another condition would be that he believes that the United States has no real time to come to Taiwan's aid, even if it wants to, and that Europe and other powers will just accept this fait accompli that's been carried out through force, and then sort of linked with that, that the United States will be convinced not even to try. Because it realizes that the PLA has regional superiority, and Xi Jinping is confident enough that he has the military capability to repel any attempts, even if they tried. So we're scaring the Americans off. Then I think the fourth condition I would say is Chinese must have self-sufficiency and dominance in the production of semiconductors. I mean, this is vital to its economy, but also to the global economy. And TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, produces something like 50% of the world's semiconductors, and pretty much all of the really high-end stuff. So until China has actually got the capability of replacing that, I just don't think would be prepared to enter the economic disaster zone that an attack on Taiwan and potentially the destruction of TSMC would bring. Other things, I think, other conditions. Fifthly, I would say sufficient leverage over the West in terms of resources, supplies, Chinese technology, that we wouldn't be able to produce serious sanctions. Sanctions would otherwise be a problem, and I think they will be put on as things currently stand. And lastly, a lack of leverage on the part of the West that we could use our certain resources, technologies, supplies to put to blockade those, as it were, prevent those going to China. And if the Chinese economy is not sufficiently self-reliant, self-contained to weather that storm, as I said earlier, there will be an inevitable plummet in its economic performance, and a sort of situation in China of massive unemployment, unrest directed at the party. So I think until those conditions are met, it's fair to conclude that forceful ways of getting hold of Taiwan are on the back burner, and the emphasis, whatever they say, and of course they will want to maintain the idea that military threat is a realistic one, because that puts pressure on people. But whatever they say, they're going to be looking at other means of bringing Taiwan over.
Great. And considering the developments we've seen in modern warfare, mostly as a result of the Ukraine conflict, do you think China has learnt lessons from the war in how to conduct an offensive? And if so, what would a modern Chinese assault look like, do you think?
Well, I guess the other part of that unasked part that you haven't asked is, well, what's the effect on Taiwan? Because I think, as I said right at the start, invasion is a lot more difficult than defense. And so I think we should start by looking at what the Taiwanese have learned from the Ukraine war. And let's not forget, of course, that Ukraine and indeed the Iran war or the Venezuela actions, these are very different actually from what would happen. I mean, Ukraine was a war conducted over land, over fairly easy land, maneuverable land. This is a seaborne invasion, or you have to get over 100 kilometers, 100 miles of sea. So very different. But there are lessons that can be learned, and just as the PLA would have learned those lessons, in particular relating to drones, underwater drones, on top of the water drones, so the Taiwanese And the Taiwanese are pursuing what's known as a sort of hedgehog defense, because they'll never match the PLA in terms of missiles, aircraft, artillery, the whole panoply of conventional war. But then you choose not to fight a conventional war. So I think it's going to be quite difficult for China, which will be looking very closely at the lessons learned in Ukraine. But I don't think that those are, again, to reassure China that it's going to make it any easier. On the contrary, I think it's going to make defense pretty difficult. China does have the advantage that it's on home territory versus the Americans, who are based in Guam and Okinawa and Hawaii. But even so, I think, as I said earlier, it's militarily a very risky proposition, and it leads, unless it's over very quickly, to economic meltdown, which is disastrous for all of us, but for China too.
And just this week, President Trump was holding off approving a £14 billion weapons package for Taiwan. He pulled back in May after meeting with Xi Jinping, who opposes US military aid to Taiwan. What's your view of the thinking behind this move by Donald Trump?
Well, I was reluctant to get inside Xi Jinping's mind. I think I'm even more reluctant to get inside Donald Trump's mind, which seems to be far less consistent than Xi Jinping's, and therefore perhaps more difficult to read. It looks as though the weapons package was delayed because of the May meeting in Beijing between Trump and Xi, and of course he's got another meeting in September when Xi is due to go to America. So it may well be that it's being delayed till after that. I do have questions. I'm sure plenty of people do. Is exactly how meaningful this is, given that at the moment America must be burning through its stocks of weapons, and that even if you sign this off, how quickly many of those weapons will actually be produced and able to be shipped to Taiwan. But irrespective of some of those big ticket items that make up $14 billion worth, there is nevertheless, I think, a lot of work going on quietly behind the scenes, training of Taiwanese, development of drone military technology, etc. There are both with the Americans and possibly with others. This big package is sort of headline stuff, but quietly, perhaps below the surface, other things are going on, and maybe other elements of weaponry which the US can store and have been authorized in earlier packages. There was one of $11 billion earlier, not that long ago, less than a year ago, I think, which may or may not be going ahead depending on the supply of weapons. So we'll see what happens after September, and the Congress, I think, is keen for this to go ahead, but who knows what goes through the head of Donald Trump.
We've seen footage of Taiwanese military forces conducting drills before, evacuating cities and defending shorelines. How well equipped are Taiwan actually to defend against a potential invasion?
The first thing that comes to mind is fighting spirit, the desire to protect what you have, and we saw that in Ukraine that was extremely strong, and you can't really judge that until the threat is actually materializes. So what happens if the Chinese did try to invade? As I said, I don't think they will, but if they did, what sort of reaction will that provoke is very difficult to say. I think the Taiwanese have got a long way to go in terms of what I referred to earlier as this hedgehog defense of making themselves almost indigestible to any invading force. So even if you were able to conquer Taiwan, it then becomes very difficult to hold it. There'd be a lot of guerrilla warfare, etc. And that in itself, the knowledge that that would happen, that the Taiwanese have the capability of that, might also add to the deterrent effect in Xi Jinping's mind. Well, if we're going to go through months, years of guerrilla resistance, etc., this is not going to look good with my people. It's going to be destabilizing politically back in China, etc. So that's, again, hard to judge, and I think the Taiwanese are certainly the government is intent on working hard at that. How seriously your average Taiwanese young person takes that threat and therefore takes the training, you hear different accounts, with some people saying, well, no one really bothers very much about it, whereas others are more patriotic. But I think it's a really interesting long-term question, that if China did invade, blockade, whatever, use grey zone tactics, subversion, cyber attacks, and eventually manage to get the whole hold of Taiwan, what would happen, and how easy would it to be governed in the aftermath of that? And I think the answer would be pretty difficult. And there's some really big questions about what they would do with things like the currency, education, what law they would have, how they'd change the political system, which they'd almost have to do, and whether doing all that, and including stationing the PLA on Taiwan and building submarine bases, which would be an excellent thing to do. All these things might in themselves provoke more resistance, because I think the days which were the line which went out, this was back in around about sort of times of the handover of Hong Kong, when China was trying to convince Taiwan and everybody else that the handover of Hong Kong wouldn't make a great deal of difference. And so one country, two systems was a model, not just for Hong Kong, but Taiwan. And they were saying some quite sort of expansive things. Yes, you can continue with your currency, your legal system, your form of government. It's very light, etc. That's changed under Xi Jinping. And so, again, that's going to, the Taiwanese see that, and they're attached to their country. They're attached to their way of life, the freedoms that they have. And I think most of them don't want to, suffer the restraints and the totalitarianism of people in China. So not easy to judge in advance, but I think the risk is that there would be quite some considerable resistance, even if the Chinese army managed to conquer Taiwan. And all that has to feed through into Xi Jinping's calculus on whether it's worth it.